Thank you for listening to RoadSigns, the podcast series from Transport Topics that explores the trends and technologies that are shaping the future of trucking. In this episode, we're going to take you inside the making of TT's 2024 Top 100 For-Hire Carriers list, which we just published on June 24th. This annual ranking provides an updated look at North America's largest trucking companies based on annual revenue. But this isn't just a list of the top 100 largest for-hire carriers. It also contains information on each company's equipment, operating divisions, current executives, and more. I think of it as an annual, in-depth snapshot of the industry's largest players. Each year, we gather the data for this project through an annual survey that we send out to these companies. We also incorporate data from public earnings reports and work with SJ Consulting Group to generate revenue estimates as needed to create the most complete list possible. To review our top takeaways from this year's Top 100 For-Hire Carriers list, I'm going to bring in my colleague, Mike Senatori, Features Coordinator at Transport Topics. Thanks for joining the conversation, Mike.
Happy to join, Seth. Thanks for having me.
So, as you know, our Top 100 For-Hire Carriers project is much more than a list of trucking companies. It's also a snapshot of the business and market conditions in the trucking industry, really those operating conditions that set the stage for how companies perform and navigate the challenges and regulatory issues they encounter. So this year, the top story very much was the ongoing freight recession and the financial strain it has been placing on for-hire motor carriers really for the past 2 years, since mid-2022. We've seen, unfortunately, a persistent oversupply of freight hauling capacity, and that's been holding down freight rates. And of course, shippers have had a leg up in terms of negotiations during this time period, given the oversupply of capacity relative to demand. And as a result, trucking companies have really had to survive on these lower rates while also tightly managing their operating expenses as they wait for the inevitable market rebound. And we're still, of course, waiting to see when that will materialize. And these market conditions are very much evident in the data that we gathered for this project. As you survey the top 100 and really look at these companies and how they performed, the preponderance of the companies that qualified for the top 100 reported declining revenues and weaker profits last year. This is based on 2023 data, and 2023 was unequivocally a down year for the industry. But let's go ahead and dig into this a bit further. So, Mike, when you take a look at the top 100, review the publication, what does the revenue and profit data say to you about the state of the trucking industry last year?
Yeah, so the picture from 2023 is clear, and it was not a good one for motor carriers. Revenues and profits took pretty big hits at most for-hire carriers due to the challenging market conditions that you mentioned, the overcapacity issues that a lot of carriers were facing. One of the very few companies on this list that actually was able to increase their profits in 2023 was FedEx, largely due to its internal drive program that's intended to kind of transform operations and increase profitability. But that's of the big names on this list, that's one of the very few that was able to really increase profits in 2023, make it a profitable year. Otherwise, these lower profits and revenues across the board led most carriers to take pretty conservative business strategies. They became more selective about resource allocation among markets that they serve, and really in 2023, a lot of companies were emphasizing efficiency in their operations in order to try to make it out of the freight recession that we've been seeing.
Yeah, for sure. And in a lot of cases, that took the form of turning down bad freight. If it's not going
Right.
to be profitable, maybe if it can help you, on a backhaul or reposition your equipment, that's a factor, of course. But increasingly, the industry was moving freight, and it might even be similar volumes of freight compared to say 2022, but moving that freight for less and just
Definitely.
pulling in less revenue and less profitability, even while staying busy in a lot of cases. So if you're a trucking company that was profitable, that grew your revenue, grew your profits last year, you were probably an outlier. It was a tough year. And yes, we're looking specifically at the top 100 largest carriers on this list, but usually the trend line that you see for the top 100 is a pretty good indication of what's happening more broadly in the marketplace, or at least a good indication of that. Now, to compile our top 100 list, we send out an annual survey that asks carriers to submit updated revenue and other data that we use in the publication. That's our primary source of information that we use to shape the top 100. Uh, Now, of course, that type of information, revenue and profits are readily available for public companies, but most of the companies on the top 100 are privately held. So it's really up to them, their willingness to share that data voluntarily. And perhaps unsurprisingly, in a very down year, we received fewer survey responses this year, and in the middle of a down market, and a time when most companies saw their businesses shrink. It's a little bit harder to share that information when it's negative than the previous few years when companies were still growing, especially back in 2021. But Mike, could you maybe just take a moment here to explain how we compiled all the data for this project, and also just go over some of the data gathering challenges that we encountered this year in particular?
Yeah, so the process of gathering data for this year's list certainly had its challenges, as you said. Uh, our data gathering process typically consists of a mixture of survey responses and publicly available data. And so we use all the data that we're able to collect through those means to build our top 100 list and all of our industry sector lists. But as you mentioned, we did experience a downturn in volume of survey responses, and that can put us in a bit of a difficult spot sometimes, particularly for private companies that keep that financial data close to the chest. Um, we try to reach a balance each year in making sure that carriers that we know should be on the list are represented, but at the same time making sure that we're not relying too heavily on estimates for company revenues. In every case, we would much rather publish a figure that's verified and from the source directly. So using the data we were able to gather in tandem with industry analysis and data from our partners at SJ Consulting Group, we were able to come up with revenue estimates for the companies where we felt confident in prior year data that to allow us to find an estimate for the company's 2023 revenue.
Yeah, for sure. There's certainly an art to this as well. It's not purely a science because you have to make decisions on best available data. Companies that we know are top 100 level, but we don't have recent data. Uh, that's where some of the estimates come in. Working with SJ Consulting and also factoring in uh, market trends, right? So if we have
Mm-hmm.
like prior year data that's very solid, um, and have to apply, what are the market trends? It could be industry wide or it could be industry segment specific, to do our best to put together, uh, with the data we have, the best, most complete top 100 list that we can to best reflect the top companies in our industry. And it's always a challenge. There's always a lot of tough decisions that have to be made, but we did have to rely more than any of us would like on estimates this particular year with a little bit less data to pull from. That being said, we certainly appreciate all the folks who responded to the survey, who responded to our inquiries and provided this information, even in a down year, so we can offer up this resource for the industry. Now, I should mention at this point that the top 100 list is live. You can view the full list online now at ttnews.com. And I'd also like to invite you to keep up to date on our annual rankings and trucking industry news by subscribing to Transport Topics at ttn.ws/ttsubscribe. You can also text TT Subscribe to 571 622 0001. Now, taking a closer look at the list, perhaps the biggest change this year is a company that is not on the list, and that's Yellow Corporation, which ceased operations and filed for bankruptcy last summer after 99 years in business. So, Yellow was number 13 on the top 100 a year ago, and not only was one of the biggest players in the LTL sector, but also really just an iconic name in the trucking industry, a very well known company that has been around for so long, almost a century. And so, of course, it is sad to publish this year's top 100 without that company on the list. So, in addition to the loss of 30,000 jobs, this was a big shakeup in the LTL market. But of course, in the months since, we've seen some of Yellow's former rivals have since acquired and even have begun reopening some of the company's closed terminals. So the market is adjusting. Other companies are starting to fill that void, and the LTL sector is starting to get back to normalcy. But Mike, what's your perspective on how Yellow's closure changes the top 100 and especially our LTL sector list?
Yeah, obviously the loss of Yellow has already had a massive impact on our list just by its absence, really. It was a mainstay on both the top 100 list and the LTL sector list. As has been highly discussed, Yellow had struggled to reach profitability for an extended period of time before it closed its doors. And a closure of this magnitude has the sorry, and a closure of this magnitude has certainly shaken up the landscape of the LTL market. As you've mentioned, we've seen competitors trying to pick at the scraps ever since, acquiring a number of Yellow's locations and equipment. And it's a bit too soon to see the financial ramifications of these acquisitions and to really see the shift in the market on our list this year. But I expect the LTL sector list in next year's publication to really bear the full effect of Yellow's closure.
So beyond Yellow, I'd like to just go ahead and dive a little bit deeper into this year's rankings. So if you start at the very top, you see package delivery giant UPS is number one. That is no surprise, even though its annual revenue dropped below 91 billion last year, and that was down from 100 billion a year prior. That type of revenue decline was actually very typical for the list this year, and in many cases, we saw even steeper drop offs in revenue. And so, not far behind UPS, of course, is FedEx at number two. Then, of course, there's a significant uh, gap between UPS and FedEx and the rest of the list. But coming in at number three this year, once again, is trucking and intermodal services provider JB Hunt, followed by Canadian trucking conglomerate TFI International at number four, and LTL carrier XPO at number five. So that top five is actually unchanged from a year ago, despite the changes in revenue. But the top 100 list actually starts to get much more interesting right after that. So, Mike, what are some of the companies and ranking changes that really stand out to you as you review this year's top 100 for hire carriers?
So, looking outside the top five, which remained unchanged, as you said, there's a fairly strong pattern of carriers that were able to minimize the declines to their revenue in 2023, corresponding to jumping up in the rankings this year. Because so much of the field saw revenue declines in 2023, the carriers who were able to keep those year over year revenue losses really in the single digit of percent change, they fared pretty well relative to the rest of the carriers on the list. Just looking in the top 20, carriers like number 8, Old Dominion, number 11, Estes Express, Penske at number 13, Werner at number 16. These carriers, they were able to move up the list this year by minimizing their revenue losses and weathering the storm more effectively than their competitors. And that pattern is not it's not a hard and fast rule across the list, but it's something that really jumps out when you're looking at which companies had the most significant falls down the list compared to last year's edition.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there are certainly companies that shrank last year, but still moved up this list because the revenue declined at by a smaller amount than some of their peers in the industry,
Mhm.
which does reflect, I think, the overall market conditions were quite challenging across the industry last year. Another issue that, of course, always plays a large role in shaping the top 100 from year to year are mergers and acquisitions. That was certainly true again this past year. TFI at number four continued to expand its reach through its acquisition of Dasky Inc. Dasky, of course, is the largest flatbed and heavy specialized carrier in North America, and that transaction was valued at 1.1 billion and closed in April of this year. Dasky was number 31 on this list last year, and it continues to run its portfolio of flatbed and heavy haul trucking companies as part of TFI's truckload segment moving forward. And another move that really had some ripple effects across the industry, truck leasing and logistics firm Ryder System expanded its dedicated contract carriage business with its February acquisition of Cardinal Logistics, which was number 51 on the list a year ago. Now, given the scope of that acquisition, we took the additional step of factoring in projected revenue from Cardinal's operations, which helped Ryder's trucking and logistics business climb 3 spots this year to number 6 on the top 100. I should also mention that we did took a similar measure with Dasky at TFI to calculate their revenue to best reflect the business and the status of these companies as they're currently operating now this year in mid 2024. Another one that of course I have to mention is number 7 Knight Swift. It feels like it's old news at this point, but their blockbuster purchase of U.S. Express closed in July 2023, and that was actually very shortly after TT published last year's top 100. So last year we did have U.S. Express still as a separate entity on our top 100 list because that deal had not yet been finalized at the publication date. But here we are a year later, and of course the updated list now reflects that with U.S. Express now part of Knight Swift. Another one that I'll quickly mention is Heartland Express. Heartland Express jumped to number 34 on the list this year, up from 58. So that's quite a big jump, and that's due in large part, of course, to its 2022 acquisitions of Smith Transport and CFI. So there's a lot there, Mike, when you look at all the M&A activity and all that's happened really in the last year or two. When you review all this M&A activity we see on the list, what stands out to you the most?
Well, TFI International continuing its strategy of buying up large carriers with the acquisition of Dasky had a really huge impact. TFI already boasted a pretty large collection of operating units that uh, that operate in the flatbed and heavy haul market, but the acquisition really cements TFI's spot as the market leader in flatbed and heavy haul. And Heartland Express, as you mentioned, also saw the benefits of its own aggressive acquisition strategy. The additions of Smith Transport and TFI led to a major jump in revenue in 2023. At the same time, profits did take a massive hit due in large part to the deal, but really a year of record high operating revenue for the carrier is nothing to take lightly and definitely a result of those acquisitions.
Yeah, and we'll watch this very closely. And now this is, of course, not something that's tied to the for hire carriers list, but very recently we've uh, saw that UPS, number 1 on our list, did go ahead and sell its Coyote Logistics business, which is, of course, a freight brokerage operation. So it
Right.
doesn't factor very much into this list. It's much more relevant to our top 100 logistics companies list that we published earlier this year. But the company did sell Coyote Logistics to RXO. RXO, of course, is a major, already a major freight broker, and will really expand through that acquisition. So it's more, yet another example of M&A, including that very recent example. That's more on the logistics side of the industry, but it goes to show just how much change we are currently experiencing in this market. We really have seen an uptick in really high profile blockbuster M&A, and we'll see how long that continues. Another piece of the conversation that I always like to bring up is the new companies on the list. Now, in some cases, we have had to remove companies that appeared on the top 100 list in the past, simply due to a lack of current revenue data, just not reliable enough, or just too outdated for us to feel confident putting them on the list. And that did open up a few new slots. So we do have quite a few new companies on the list this year. One of the companies that is right in the middle of the list at number 57 is Manitoulin Group, a Canadian LTL carrier headquartered in Ontario's Manitoulin Island that also offers expedited cross-border, dedicated intermodal and logistics services. Another newcomer is number 66 First Fleet, a dedicated contract carrier and truckload operator based in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Bay Transportation, refrigerated carrier and logistics provider based in Eagan, Minnesota, joins the list at number 82. We also have Commerce, California based dedicated carrier TCI Transportation making its debut this year at number 86. And I'll quickly mention a few others, especially in the 90s. We saw quite a few newcomers. Those include number 94 Ward Transport and Logistics of Altoona, Pennsylvania, number 95 Acme Truck Line of Gretna, Louisiana, number 97 Cross Country Freight Solutions of Bismarck, North Dakota, number 98 May Trucking Company of Salem, Oregon, number 99 Highlight Motor Group of Concord, Ontario, and number 100, finalizing the list, is Speedy Delivery Service of St. Cloud, Minnesota. So that's quite a few new names that joined the list this year. We'll see how many of those companies are able to grow and maintain those positions next year, as hopefully we see the freight market start to reach equilibrium and more of these companies start to grow their profits and grow their revenue. But Mike, as you take a look at all these newcomers, all these new names on the list, which are you watching most closely? And do you think we'll continue to see more names make it onto the top 100 list in the coming years? More newcomers.
Yeah, so while some of the newcomers to this year's list are the result of improved visibility on our end and likely could have made the top 100 in years past, a number of them benefited from the drop offs of other carriers who came in near the end of last year's top 100. So, as you mentioned, in the 90s, especially, we see a lot of shifts. Six of the final 10 carriers on this year's list are newcomers, which really speaks to the volatility of the market, seeing so many companies drop off of last year's list. And, those spots remain open for new companies to come and take that place. In terms of newcomers that I'm watching most closely, Tennessee-based First Fleet joined the list this year at number 66, operating primarily as a dedicated carrier, and it also debuted at number 16 on our truckload and dedicated sector list. And despite the market difficulties faced by many of its competitors, First Fleet was able to increase its operating revenue in 2023 by 3.6%. So that, that's an indicator to me that First Fleet could be a company to keep an eye on, as it really could become a mainstay of the list going forward.
Yeah, and of course, it also the industry consolidation that we've seen certainly also opens up some spots on the top 100. No U.S. Express separate entry, no separate entry for Cardinal Logistics.
Right.
That no separate entry for Dasky. That frees up a lot of spots as well. So we're starting to see the barrier or the threshold for top 100 level has actually gone down, especially in a year where overall revenues are down.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see again if that continues. If we'll see more consolidation at the top, and if that starts to, make it a little bit easier to crack that top 100 level in the future. Once again, at this point, I wanted to reiterate that you can view the full top 100 list online at ttnews.com. Of course, in addition to the main top 100 list, we also publish several industry sector lists that are looking at the largest companies that operate in specific segments of the trucking industry. That includes LTL, refrigerated, flatbed, bulk, parcel couriers, and more. Even some more specialized industry lists. And really, I think sometimes those provide a lot of value because it allows companies to see, how you really stack up against your true competitors in the market, right? The companies that you're going head to head for out there in the market, and this is a good way to view that. But Mike, are there any big changes or maybe points of interest that you'd like to discuss as you look over those updated sector lists this year?
Well, we touched earlier on Ryder Systems' acquisition of Cardinal Logistics, but the impact it has had and will continue to have on the truckload and dedicated market is pretty significant. Uh, Ryder has publicly estimated that the deal will net an additional $1 billion in revenue, which has been taken into account for Ryder's data on this year's list, and it allowed it to move up to number 5 on our list of truckload and dedicated carriers, a pretty significant jump, and we're likely to continue seeing the ramifications of that deal going forward. And elsewhere on the sector list, the trend really continued. The trend of overcapacity and weak freight rates straining revenues, it's still the leading story. Looking at all of our sector lists, excluding the list of transportation contractors for the USPS, more than half of the carriers on each of our sector lists faced declining revenue in 2023. And in many cases, it was a much larger percentage of that list. So,
Yeah.
as we've been discussing, the trends and of the difficult market conditions, they've been in effect across industry segments.
Yeah, for sure. And the whole market, I think the whole industry is eagerly awaiting this rebound in freight rates. Perhaps the shippers aren't, but the companies that we cover on this list are eagerly awaiting that rebound, and hopefully we'll see that sooner rather than later. Now, before we wrap up, I just want to mention that we're always encouraging companies to participate in our Top 100 For-Hire Carriers project by filling out the annual survey we referenced earlier and sharing details about their operations. We ask for, of course, revenue and when companies are willing to share it, profit as well. But we're also gather information like company employees, updated lists of top executives, operating units. And we do publish data on quite a few mid-sized companies, in our sector rankings as well. So it's certainly worth your effort. Even if your organization isn't among the industry's largest, you may still have and deserve a place on these lists. And any company that is large enough to qualify for them, we want you on our radar. We want to give you, the credit, that you deserve for your place in the industry. So, Mike, could you just take a moment here to tell our listeners how they can get involved, if they're not already, and how can they participate in next year's Top 100 For-Hire Carriers project if they haven't already done this in the past?
Sure. So, the best way to make sure that your company is considered for inclusion on our top 100 list and all of our industry sector lists is to reach out to us directly. You can email tteditor@trucking.org and express your interest in participating, and we'll be in contact with information on how you can submit your company's data to our annual survey.
Well, I think that's a great stopping point here. Mike, thank you again for taking some time to talk about our updated top 100 list and sector lists. And of course, thank you for, once again, for all the hard work, that goes into this project. This is really, of all the large scale projects that Transport Topics produces every year, this is number one on the list in terms of the amount of work, amount of data that goes into putting this together. So it always feels good to get it out and publish it and share it with the world, which we just recently did this year. But appreciate all the work that goes into this, and I think it's a very valuable resource for the industry.
Of course, Seth. Thanks for having me on the show.
We hope you've enjoyed this in-depth look at Transport Topics' 2024 Top 100 For-Hire Carriers list. As a final reminder, you can view the entire Top 100 and sector lists online at ttnews.com. And of course, if you're a Transport Topics subscriber, you already have a hard copy packaged with the June 24th issue of Transport Topics. If you've enjoyed this episode of RoadSigns, please let others know. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If my questions have sparked questions of your own, share them with me and the RoadSigns team. You can email us at share@ttnews.com. We'll read them and respond daily. And of course, we'll be back soon with a fresh episode of RoadSigns. Until then, I'm Seth Clevenger. Thank you for listening.
Did you know you can ask Alexa to open Transport Topics? In just 1 minute, you will hear the biggest trucking headlines of that day. Be prepared and start your morning off right with Transport Topics.